the intensity of kink is very much this notion of how far are you cranking up that volume knob on your pursuit down into the shadows. There's a certain percentage of the population that feels that way, and they are stigmatized by the rest of the population because if everybody is doing this, there's some risk that society is going to tear itself apart because everybody's trying to crank it to 11, and society just can't handle that.
Our question today is a relatively straightforward one from Candace. Why does BDSM and kink feel like it's stigmatized in today's culture?
This is a really great question, and it has a lot of depth to it. I think it's not just in today's culture, it's in every culture, because that's what makes BDSM BDSM. That's what makes kink kinky, is the fact that it is the part of you that is not acceptable to society. It's reclaiming that part. It's reintegrating those parts of yourself that are suppressed in the process of becoming a functioning member of society. Infants are not kinky because they just do whatever the fuck they want all the time. They're not socialized. No, you can't just pee on yourself. You have to go to the special room and pee in the special thing.
What?
And yeah, and so the process begins of taking an infant and turning it into a social being. In the process of that, we create a persona and we suppress parts of ourselves into the shadow. A lot of the work of adulthood is reclaiming that shadow and reintegrating it so that you can be your whole self and reveal parts of yourself as they are appropriate to the circumstance, and you have control over which part of yourself is operative when. But if nothing were suppressed, if nothing were stigmatized, if you could just pee on yourself and you were just an infant walking around naked doing whatever you wanted, then sure, there would be no BDSM and there would be no kink. But even the notion of, hey, you have to cover your nakedness before you go outside, you're creating BDSM and kink. Then getting naked is intimate. It's transversive all of a sudden because now that's a side of me that I don't reveal in public. And then you just, if you want to make intimacy into kink, you just crank it to 11. And so now you're not just naked in front of me, but I tell you, turn around, spread your legs, bend over, and show me that pussy. And now that display of your nakedness enhances all of that underlying substructure of you're not supposed to show your naked body to people, which was something that we were socialized into as children, and it flares the emotionality immediately.
Well, that's an interesting take. So are you saying that were it not for the fact that kink exists in the shadow, there would be no stigmatization at all? Is that sort of the essence of the argument?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. So when I hear the word stigma, I think about a sort of negative judgment associated with the act. Like society's looking at it, I'm like, well, that's bad. You should not be doing it. If you are doing it, there's something wrong with you. It comes from the word kink. They say there's something wrong with you.
Bent.
Yeah, you're bent, out of shape. And that's not the same thing as embracing your shadow, because you could make the perfectly coherent argument that if a person is engaging in safe sex, safe consensual BDSM play with their partner, there should be no stigma about that whatsoever. And I think what the question is getting at is society, generally speaking, views that fundamentally, whether you're doing it with consensual partner or not, as just something weird and, oh, those weird people that, whip each other, those people they're just weird and like we don't talk about them. Polite people don't do that. Well-adjusted people don't do that. There's still this sense in the general society that people who are kinky are perhaps working through trauma, or there must be something deeply wrong with them for them to want to do that. And I think that's part of maybe that's where some of that stigma and judgment is coming from. But there certainly isn't, I think, in society today, a sense of, especially perhaps in the older generation, perhaps the younger generation is a bit more okay with this, but in the older generation is like, well, if you're doing all this BDSM stuff, someone must have touched you when you were younger and now you're working it all out. There's even stories, even popular media, and I think I talked about this in another episode. There's a series called The Normal People, which is actually a pretty good series. It's about this couple. This is in England or something, and they just cannot communicate with each other, and they break up and get together, get together multiple times. And in one of their breakups, the girl is so devastated. She's just so shattered. She hates her life so much that, oh my God, she just starts doing BDSM. right? And that entire story arc of that particular episode where she just got really kinky and she was into BDSM, it was meant to show how down in the depths she had descended to, how destroyed she was, that she resorted to being choked and slapped by some sexual deviant. And I think that's the stigma that the question is really pointing to.
Yeah, but that's not wrong. That should be society's point of view. That's the challenging part. It shouldn't be your point of view. It shouldn't be the individual's point of view. But it should be the society's point of view in some
But what
sense.
if society evolved and recognized, let's, for example, say they read your book and they all understand, oh, this is actually totally normal behavior. There's nothing actually wrong with this. There's no reason at all to judge anyone on this. And then tomorrow, all of society decides that, hey, all this slapping around and choking and whips and belts and all this dominant, submissive stuff, that's all completely normal. Even the Pope said it was okay. And has suddenly, if that's the case, does it lose its effectiveness then?
Yeah,
Is
in
it
many
not
ways
BDSM?
it would. In many ways it would. Yeah.
Oh, that's so interesting. Okay, I did not think you were going with that. Okay, so then to some extent, the expression of your shadow is contingent on what society is thinking, right? Then you would have to move and go somewhere else.
Yeah, in societies where nudity is the norm, there's no shame around body display. There's no emotionality. There's no intensity around walking around naked because that's just what everybody does. Whereas in our society, getting naked with a partner is a big deal. That's a moment in any dating relationship where you first get naked with each other. And there's a significant amount of shyness and there's a significant amount of hesitancy and, oh, do we really trust each other this much? And, oh, am I comfortable with this? And but if you're in a native tribe that just walks around naked, none of that exists because why would you be emotional about your everyday, ordinary life in public society? Whatever is kept private is the thing that is in the shadow. Whatever is suppressed by society. And so if in such a native tribe, if saying the word sex out loud is the thing that you're not allowed to do and everybody teaches the children, you can't say this word, well, then saying that word is the intimate thing. And that's kink in that cultural milieu.
No, but what if the society, so I do understand what you're saying is that there's a public-facing persona. This is how you are with quote-unquote polite society. You're not supposed to do these things with other people around. And then if you do them in the context of a partnership, an intimate partnership, then that gives it a different kind of flavor. And it's that dichotomy of you're not doing it in society, you're doing it in private. But we're talking about the judgment of society, even in the actions that you partake in private. And in fact, your example of nudity is a perfect example of that. Like, it's quite a moment when you're nude for the first time with a partner. And yet there's no part of society that would stigmatize the sense that, oh, you being naked with a partner is somehow wrong. But they do stigmatize a whole bunch of other BDSM stuff. Not that being naked is BDSM, but when it comes to specific BDSM things, society at large does look at that in a stigmatized way. They don't think about you being naked with your wife or a partner in a stigmatized way. That's not stigmatized at all.
Well, to some degree, that's just a matter of how far into the shadow you're going. Just getting naked is a little into the shadow, but not very far. It's not suppressed that much by society. Everybody knows. Everybody does it. Everybody gets naked in the shower. Everybody gets naked when they have sex. Like, there's an awareness there. But when you give the example I gave before of making your partner display herself, and you can see even in... So that was a very BDSM typical example, is giving the command to a partner to fully display her genitals to you. That's pretty far in the BDSM. In the middle is maybe a girl dressing up and wearing lingerie. And there is a little bit of tittering about that. Society does have, even in media, you see that. Oh, she got into lingerie. Oh, it was very racy lingerie. Now it's not just underwear, it's garter and stockings. Now, even within lingerie, there's a genre of how far into the shadow are you going? And that's not just, oh, yes, we took our clothes off and then had sex in the missionary position. That's not very far into the shadow. And so... yeah, I think that the intensity of kink is very much this notion of how far are you cranking up that volume knob on your pursuit down into the shadows.
Maybe where we're talking past each other is a little bit is how I understand the word stigma. So another way of reformulating that word is if I had some sort of a person I looked up to in my life who I trusted, and I went up to that person and says, you know what, I really love like tying a woman up and spanking her, would that person turn to me and say, oh, you should not do that, that's wrong to do, you are damaging yourself in some way by doing that? And I considered that kind of attitude spread through society in general as a stigma. And I think a lot of people, there's a sense of society of like, society thinks you should not do those sort of actions. Even in the context of a consensual, intimate partner, you should not do it still. And that's what the idea of stigma means to me.
Yeah, I've always wondered about that in terms of like, to what degree does society's claim that you should not do it really mean we don't want to know about it? Like, to what degree is that the statement is that if you make it known that you love having kinky sex, then you get slut shamed. And it's not, you wouldn't get slut shamed if we didn't know about it, but we are enforcing the social order by shaming this behavior,
Well,
even if
think
it's
of a thought experiment.
because it's no longer private if I know about it.
So for example, if some celebrity had pictures of her exposed where she was doing a lot of kinky stuff, society may judge her, but what if it was all within the context of some 20-year marriage that she was in? It would not have the same sort of flavor of shaming. People wouldn't think of her really as a slut. She's like, no, she's having sex with her husband. So it would not be the same kind of judgmental thing. So I don't know that I agree that if you just tell people, well, I do these things, or they find out about these things, they will automatically construe that as, if it's a woman, as a slut. But I think generally speaking, society at large, what the question is getting at is that society looks down on these things as perhaps, if society personified into some sort of omniscient God, society will want to eliminate that thing. It's like, oh, this is an unhealthy part of our society. If our society was healthier, these things would not exist. And I think that's what the question is getting at is, why do we think that attitude still pervades in society? And my answer to that is, it's not well understood. That's the reason why people just don't understand what BDSM is, because what it's trying to do, and again, I have said this in multiple episodes, my own understanding has been through you and through the book you've written, and that has given me, because I was that kind of person. Like, I think like 10 years ago, I remember you came over to my place once and I was telling about this girl that I was saying who wanted me to do all these crazy things to her. And I told you, I'm like, God, she must be a total weirdo. And you were trying to explain it back then, like, no, this is BDSM. And I was not having any part of it. I'm like, well, I don't want to associate with those crazy people. But I didn't get it back then. And so my answer to this question is people just don't understand, or at least they don't have access to the sort of philosophy of kink and BDSM that you've expounded in your book, that I think is very valuable. It's part of the motivations for doing this podcast, actually. We're trying to bring it out of the dark a little bit and trying to say that, no, there's actual psychological underpinnings to this behavior that makes perfect sense once you understand it and should not be stigmatized or thought down upon, or thought of as something that should be eradicated from society.
That's an interesting notion. I do think I have a different intuition than you. If a celebrity were married and many years and then photos or evidence came out that she was super kinky and this and that, I do think there would be some shaming. I think that the shaming would revolve around the supposed discrepancy between her proper public image and what was found out about her private life, as though she had been fooling people into claiming that she was so prim and proper, and actually you're just a slut, like whatever. And so I think there would be some schadenfreude. So there would be some in terms of that response. I do think there would be some shaming, particularly if she had a relatively shiny public image. And so I have a different intuition there. I think that's related to this. I also think that there is some stigmatization of people who don't take life easy, maybe. I think I've always been deeply moved by the book The Spirituality of Imperfection, which is out of the Alcoholics Anonymous canon of literature, that alcoholism is a response to an individual's torn to pieces hood. It's their way of being that is somehow torn apart, that they perceive the dual nature of man as both spiritual and godly and also earthly and animalistic, and it tears them apart. They don't take that easily. They don't take that well. And thus, the experience of life and that spiritual search is felt much more keenly by a certain segment of the population. And so, yeah, I mean, the quote from the book is less than the gods, more than the beasts, and yet somehow also both. And I've always resonated with the emotionality of that. I don't find alcoholism particularly surprising in that context. I think that it is nonetheless socially shamed, and that is society protecting itself from it spreading on some level beyond the few that are just susceptible to it on some level. And I think there's something similar with kink, is that some people, self-included, the subtitle of my book, or the original subtitle, it's changing, but the original subtitle of my book is Reflections in the Mirror of Kink, for people who want a sex life like LSD, not Chardonnay. And that's the idea, is that some people just don't want Chardonnay as their sex life. They want their sex life to be the equivalent of LSD. And not everybody does. Some people are perfectly happy with Chardonnay. I'm not. But many people, the majority of society, probably are. Sex is something maybe you do for 15 minutes in the bedroom once or twice a week. You get off, it feels good, and it's not more than that. Maybe it makes you closer to your husband, it bonds you to your partner a little bit. It's nice. Like a glass of Chardonnay. There's nothing wrong with that. Many people have a glass of Chardonnay once or twice a week as well. But some people, for whatever reason, that's just not good enough. And I talk about this in the book. I say, coffee's great. Everybody loves coffee. Who was the first person who said, you know, what if I can turn this up to 9 atmospheres of pressure and brew it ultra ground fine and get all of that flavor into 1/10 of the volume and make espresso? Who was the first set of people, probably not one person, who just was compelled to get more? Like, I like coffee, but more. And there's that perceptual overlay, is that, yes, it's more bitter, but it's also more flavorful. It's just more on all levels. My parents certainly hate espresso. They come to my house and I try to make them take a sip, and they just hate straight espresso, right? I love it because there's something in me that's, yes, I love coffee, crank it to 11. And I feel the same way about sex. I feel the same way about a lot of things, though not everything. Like, there's some things that I am very non-crank it to 11 about. But a lot of things I'm very much captivated by the notion of sucking all the marrow out of life, to quote Thoreau. And yeah, I think that there's a certain percentage of the population that feels that way, and they are stigmatized by the rest of the population because that's a social protective mechanism of, if everybody is doing this, there's some risk that society is going to tear itself apart because everybody's trying to crank it to 11 all the time, and society just can't handle that. We can tolerate it from about 10 to 15% of the population, but keep quiet about it, please. I do think that it's a socially protective thing, that society tries to frown on it and push it down and push it away. I do think it's negative for the people who are in that 10 to 15%, just like for alcoholics, where you have that spiritual longing and you don't quite know where to go. For me, this podcast is an outlet for that 10 to 15%. It's not for the general population. I don't give a shit whether BDSM is accepted or not. I think it's better if it's not. But for that 10 to 15% that's already pulled deeply for deeper experiences of intimacy, meaning, and experience sexually, the process of how to do that safely, how to do that well, and where to go, I think that's my vision for the podcast.